Hello and welcome to Help Me Believe. My name's Haden Clark, your host. This is the show about Christian apologetics and theology. Our aim is to strengthen the believer and answer the critic. Today on the show, I'll be doing something a little bit different. I will be interviewing Dr. Karen Swallow Pryor about her latest book on reading well, finding the good life through great books. And so that's not necessarily theology or apologetics, but I felt like well, number one, I just really like Dr. Pryor and her works. So as I had an opportunity to interview her, I was going to take it. But also, I feel like reading is something very fundamental to anything that you're going to set out to do. If you're going to set out to learn apologetics, if you're going to set out to learn theology, if you're going to set out to learn anything, you need to know how to read. But if you're going to read a lot, you might as well learn how to read well and read virtuously, which is what her latest book is all about. So I was going to give you a little bio of Dr. Pryor before we get into the interview that I did with her. Karen Swallow Pryor is the professor of English at Liberty University, where she has won multiple teaching awards. This is coming right off her website. She writes frequently on literature, culture, ethics, and ideas. Her writing appears at Christianity Today, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, First Things, Vox, Think Christian, The Gospel Coalition, Books and Culture, and many other places. She is the author of Booked, Literature in the Soul of Me, which we talked a little bit about in the interview, and Fierce Convictions, The Extraordinary Life of Hannah More, which is a wonderful book about a 18th century abolitionist, Hannah More. You got to read that one too. Poet, reformer, abolitionist, and on reading well, finding the good life through great literature, which is the topic of discussion today on the show. I didn't sit down with her. We did a Skype interview and interviewed her about this book, and keep watching and you'll see all of that. I did want to make you aware that if you want to see the bonus segment of the show where I ask Dr. Pryor a few extra questions, a little bit more personal, kind of off-the-wall questions, you can subscribe or support our ministry at patreon.com/helpmebelieve, and you can do that for as little as $1. And I'll have links for that, as well as I'll have links to the book and to Dr. Pryor's website and different things as well in the description below. So sit tight, enjoy the show. Hello and welcome to Help Me Believe. My name's Haden Clark. This is the show about Christian apologetics and theology, but today we will be talking about something a little bit different, but it's really fundamental if you think about it to theology or apologetics or whatever area of study you might want to engage in, and that is reading. Reading is fundamental to any body of knowledge that you want to learn about, but more specifically today. So if you're going to read, you might as well learn how to read virtuously and learn how to read well. And so today we are going to be talking about a new book that's come out called On Reading Well. The subtitle is Finding the Good Life Through Great Books. And it just so happens that my guest is the author of that book, the marvelous Dr. Karen Swallow Pryor. Karen, how are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me. I was going to say, I recognize that book cover.
Well, thank you for being here. I am going to get this out of the way. I'm a big fan, like all your works, and so I'll try not to fangirl throughout the interview, but no promises.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. How are you doing? How are you feeling? I know that you've been going through a recovery process. How's that going?
It's going miraculously well. I'm very thankful. Over 3 months ago, I was hit by a bus, and I'm just now walking with the help of a cane, which is a huge step forward. Sorry, no pun intended.
Yeah.
But so that so I feel a little bit more normal being able to get around, even though I've got a lot of muscle to rebuild and pain to work through. But I'm very thankful.
Well, that's great news. Like I said earlier before we started, we've been praying for you, so that's good to hear that you're doing well. Okay, well, let's jump into things if you don't mind. First of all, if would you mind telling us just a little bit about yourself for those who may not be familiar with you or your work? If you could give us kind of a little background information about who is Dr. Karen Swallow Pryor.
Sure. I am a professor of English at Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia. I actually am starting this school year, my 20th year there. So I've been there a long time.
Yeah,
I guess I'll stay.
I guess so.
Yeah. So I teach English literature, a lot of different courses. My specialty is 18th century British literature, but I teach a lot more than that. And in particular, the English novel, which encompasses the 18th and 19th century. And on the side, I write for mainly popular audiences, and my writing appears at Christianity Today, The Atlantic, Fox, Washington Post, the Gospel Coalition, and I've written 3 books. The third one is the one we're talking about today. I love writing about culture and the church, but I especially love writing about literature.
Okay, great. You've been at Liberty for 20 years. That's a long time.
That's a long time,
Yeah.
yeah.
Uh, what classes are you teaching? I heard some good news that you are going to be able to, despite the tragedy that happened, you are going to be able to. You made it to the first day of school, correct?
Yes, we
Yeah.
just finished our first week, and the day that classes start is the day I was given clearance to put weight on both of my legs, and
Wow.
so the first week was a little bit rough,
Right.
but now, as I said, I've got the cane and I'm getting stronger every day, and so it just worked out that that my recovery. That big milestone coincided with the start of classes, so I feel good being back, to be living a more normal
Yeah.
life and be energized by my students and my classes. So,
Yeah. Well, that's amazing that the first day back was the first day you were able to do, like you said,
yeah.
put weight on. But that's amazing. That's great. Okay, so tell us a little bit about the book. Kind of maybe a big picture idea. What is the thesis? What is the purpose? Just that sort of thing. What's the main idea?
Well, I'll start with the background, which is my first book, Book to Literature and the Soul of Me, which is a literary and spiritual memoir, basically about the books that most changed my life and ultimately returned me to my to a faith in God. I mean, I never lost my faith, but
Hmm.
I kind of felt like I had to choose between books and God. And so my first book is the story of that. And I talk about it in that I talk about reading promiscuously or reading
Yes, this. Yeah, I
widely.
was going to
Yeah.
ask you about this at some
Okay.
point because I heard you say this in a different podcast. I think was where I heard you
Yeah.
say reading promiscuously. I thought, oh, I like that
Uh,
phrase. I don't know if I
That's
should, but I like it.
no, you should. It actually comes from the 17th century Puritan John Milton. And the word promiscuous originally just simply meant like, and still means, inordinate mixing or, just an odd mixing with different
Okay,
things. And
so it's only
so,
a modern notion to attach to that word something maybe
right,
negative.
right.
Okay,
Well, I mean, because basically, sexual promiscuity
right.
means the same thing, but now we've taken away the
You've taken away the
adjective.
adjective. I got you.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah, yeah.
Okay. Well, that's clarifying.
Which I mean, fun little. I don't know your audience that well, but
Go for it.
so I don't know if they'll appreciate this or not. But fun little parallel is the word intercourse,
Okay.
which if you read Jane Austen or other writers, they'll talk about having intercourse, and what they actually mean is social intercourse or
Right. Yeah.
dialogue.
Yeah. I see this all the
And
time.
we've just come to just think it means one
Right.
particular kind.
One
So
particular
yeah,
little etymology
so
there. So that's
yeah,
okay.
exactly.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
So you're welcome.
I
I
don't know
love
if you
words.
remember now where you were going before I cut you off there, but go
It's all
continue,
right.
please.
Well, yeah. So Milton, when he talked about reading promiscuously, he meant reading a wide variety of works,
Mm.
not just works that you already agree with or that you think won't challenge you, that just confirm your belief. Because he believed that, as a Puritan who was very anti-Catholic Church, Roman Catholic Church, he thought that just simply to conform to what a priest tells you is heretical, and
Right.
that even if you believe the right things, but do so because someone has told you, rather than because you have studied and tested
Yep.
and tried ideas, that you would basically be essentially a heretic for not really understanding what your beliefs are.
Hmm.
So that was sort of the thesis of my first book, written a number of years ago. And I wanted to write another book about books. And as I was sitting down to research and develop this one, I realized that one of the things that's happened in the past few years, I mean, it's been happening for a long time, but it just seems like it's gotten worse in the past few years, is that people are reading a lot now because of the internet.
Hmm.
A lot of blog posts, a lot of news articles, a lot of headlines, a lot of tweets, a lot of Facebook statuses. But if you spend any time on social media, I think you realize that people may be reading, but they aren't reading very well. They
Right.
aren't paying attention. They aren't trying to understand meaning. They aren't reading charitably. And so that was sort of the kernel of the idea for this book, was to not just read widely, but read well. And that eventually developed into a study of living well,
Right.
and living virtuously.
Hmm. So yeah, I was gonna say it kind of seems like in book you were talking about reading widely or promiscuously, and then
Hmm.
in this book you wanted to highlight reading well. Is there any what does it really mean to read well? What would be characteristics of reading well as opposed to not reading well? What would not reading well look
Right.
like?
Well, in the book, I really it sort of has a double meaning.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, reading well in the sense of reading carefully and excellently and understanding meaning. But then I also developed even more throughout the book the idea of reading well so as to apply what you read to your life,
That
and
makes sense.
therefore
Okay.
to live well.
Yeah.
So so reading well on sort of a literal level, but then reading well on the level of interpretation and
Mm-hmm.
application.
Okay. You said read carefully, and I think I've heard you highlight this before whenever you talk about your despise of speed reading, or right, which is something I learned how to do in
Yeah.
seminary. But of course, we were reading nonfiction, whereas with the work of literature, you
Uh,
want to take your time and really, like you were talking about, understand and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean there is a time and place to skim,
Right.
and I do it as well. But I think what's happened is, and actually a lot of studies show this. I cite a couple of them in the book, but there's much more research out there than I delve into in the book. But it's skimming or speed reading develops habits, and therefore, unless you're really intentional about breaking that habit, then you're going to apply that to other kinds of reading. And
Hmm.
literary reading is the is reading that requires the exact opposite.
Right.
If you think of the most literary works of all, which would be poetry,
Hmm.
poetry, I mean, to speed read a poem is to miss the entire
Oh
point. I
yeah.
mean, you're probably worse off for speed reading a poem than not reading it at all.
Right.
And then, literary reading, which may not be poetry, it might be a novel, which I focus on in the book. It still uses poetic language. It still requires more interpretation and evaluation than just simply reading in, a textbook or an information manual.
Makes sense. Yep. Definitely. So one question I had, or kind of what I maybe something that stood out to me through reading the book, was this idea of um, cultivating or obtaining virtue through reading,
Hmm.
and so I was just kind of ask you about that. How does one become more virtuous by reading?
Well, by practicing the skills of reading well, which are pretty basic, some I've already mentioned, like just
Mm-hmm.
slowing
Yep.
down, paying attention, not reading just to get the point, not reading to get the sort of Cliff Notes or Spark Notes summary of the plot of a great novel, but actually reading to enjoy and the experience of reading and actually just experience it. Just as you go to a museum to look at paintings, you could just sort of speed by and say, oh, there's a vase, or oh, there's a girl
Right.
holding a watering can. You could do that, and
Yeah.
maybe some people do, but that sort of defeats the purpose of going to a museum and looking at the painting and observing the detail and observing the technique. I mean, even if you don't know anything about painting, you can stand there and look at the painting and notice things about it. And the same is true of great literature. If you slow down and notice the detail, notice the way the narrative works, notice the points of the plot or the character that the narrator withholds and reveals later or never reveals at all, and then you say, huh, I wonder why we never learned this. There must be a reason why that wasn't included. And just ask those kinds of questions. I mean, anyone is really capable of doing that. If once you achieve a third grade level of reading,
Yeah.
but we develop such bad habits and impatience, and I think also maybe a lack of confidence because we've been taught poorly by teachers in our past that that there's some secret that we're supposed to uncover,
Yeah.
some hidden meaning, when actually with a great work of literature, you can read it again and again and get something new out of it. You will never get most of it out of the first reading,
Yeah.
or ever get all of it out of subsequent readings. But so much in our culture, in our habits, dissuades us from that kind of reading.
Yep. Excuse me. You talk about Aristotle's virtues, and so one thing Aristotle said was that virtue is learned by doing, right? It's not, yeah. So how does that play out whenever you're talking about you can cultivate virtue through reading? So it would seem that reading would then be an act of doing in some sense. Is that correct?
Right. Yes. I mean, so what Aristotle said of virtue is basically a quality or characteristic that is so much a part of you that you actually don't even choose to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of at the end of the process. So the way that you develop a virtue is through practice, and which then becomes habit and then becomes part of your character.
Right.
And so the virtue, say, of courage, is a person. We can commit courageous acts that are isolated or just sort of accidental, one-time moments, and that's fine. That we could say that that's an act of courage. But Aristotle would say a courageous person is a person who acts courageous all the time without thinking about it or trying. And so, and so in the book I go through 12 different virtues and talk about what they are and what they mean and how works of literature we can learn them from. But in terms of reading virtuously, when we develop these habits of just sort of noticing, slowing down, asking questions, reflecting, if we practice it, it becomes a habit, and then it becomes something that's just the way that we read.
Mm-hmm. There was a quote, I'm not going to be able to remember it, maybe you'll be able to correct me, that said, from the characters in the book, we learn character or something of the sort.
Yeah.
You'll probably be able to say it better.
Quote myself, but
go ahead.
Literary characters have a lot to teach us about character.
Right. So this is kind of what I was thinking when I had in mind of Aristotle's quote about how to obtain virtue through practice, and then the characters in the literature. It's almost like you put yourself in their shoes, and they're learning. Their character is being developed, but of course they're a fictional character. But the reader's real, and so they can kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Vicariously. You can do that kind of vicariously.
Exactly. That's one of the benefits of reading literature, especially fiction, novels and short stories, is that we are reading about characters who aren't real, but when we encounter characters in fiction, we still make the same kinds of assessments and interpretations and evaluations as we're reading that we do in real life. That's actually what makes literary fiction literary, as opposed to, some works of fiction that are not literary, like something that a lot of Christians might write, or Harlequin romance authors might write, where they're just presenting an entertaining story, and they're actually doing a lot of telling rather than showing. But literary fiction uses language as an art, and therefore requires the reader to make more of these kinds of interpretations and evaluations, which are the same things we have to do every day. When we walk into the bank and stand in line and there's a person in front of us that we've never seen before, we have no idea what kind of person that is, what he's gone through that day, what his life is like, and just based on a few interactions, we make some interpretations and assessments in the same way that we do as we're introduced to characters in literature. And then we learn, as we get to know a character who makes mistakes, often presents us with negative examples, grows and develops, we're going through at least a kind of intellectual growth and development that parallels that character.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. One thing I got out of the book was just generally how valuable reading is, particularly in leading a virtuous life as well. Um, can you recall when you first realized how valuable reading? Have you just always seen the value in reading, or is that something that you had to learn over the years, or can you recall?
Well, I mean, my mother read to my brothers and me all the
Mm-hmm.
time when we were little, so I just had stories read to me. I remember being about 5 years old and reading Dr. Seuss on my own and saying the words out loud and pointing at them with my finger. And then I just remember, I mean, I really just got lost in books, and some of the memories that I have of the stories I read as a little girl are more real to me than memories of things that really
Yeah.
happened. And so I just always loved reading. But of course, it wasn't until I was older and became a teacher or professor that I began to think more consciously and self-awarely about, if that's a word, about the
Yeah.
power that literature has. It was just something I always knew and experienced, but didn't necessarily recognize how it worked until I was an adult.
That makes sense. I envy you in that because I don't know why, but I never, that wasn't the case for me. I didn't grow up reading books and that sort of stuff. So am I the norm? Do you think, or is your instance the norm as far as young people or children growing up learning the value of reading?
That's a really good question. And I need to start asking it because, of course, when I grew up, there was no internet,
Right.
no video games. I mean,
That's
I
a good
actually
point.
remember Pong. So
Pong,
when it
yes.
was, yes, okay, when it first came out, it probably has several iterations now. And so I think probably a lot more young people are, it may be the exception, and it probably requires some very intentional parenting to immerse children in the world of books
Hmm.
apart from all of these other things. So it probably is becoming something that is the exception,
Right.
and really need it. It still can be developed, but you've missed out on that time
I am.
when those simple magical stories
Mm. I was
that
born
you
in the
could get
wrong
lost
generation.
in.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
what
missed
I
out.
haven't really thought about this question before, so that's
Well, that's a good
really
question,
a
though.
great loss.
But
Yeah,
I think it is. I think my case is the norm today. Anyway, there are a
I bet
few.
it
There are a
is.
few like I remember from school. Kids that always read, and I never really got it until. It's a strange thing. Also, this is maybe a different phenomenon as well. But reading, I never grasped the value of reading until I became a Christian.
Hmm.
And so I don't know what it is there. I've thought about it, but I haven't been able to really put anything on it. But whenever I wouldn't call it a conversion because I grew up in a Christian home, but my faith didn't really become my own until I was about
Mm-hmm.
20 years old. And then I started reading the Bible because I wanted to read it for myself. And then I had questions and knew that there were people who have lived before me that have probably had these questions. So I read their books,
Mm-hmm.
and that just started a long line for me of getting into all kinds of literature or different works. And so, yeah, I don't know what it is there, but
Well, Christianity is a religion of the book, and
mm-hmm,
um, so they really do go together. And I'm encouraged to hear you talk about that because obviously reading the Word of God for ourselves is central to Christianity. But the same skills that are required to read the Bible well are the same ones required to read literature well. So if you practice one, you get better at the other. Now, of course, with the Bible, we have the Holy Spirit to guide us as well, but still the actual reading skills are the same and they complement one another. And the Word and words are
right.
central
I see what you.
to
Yeah.
the Christian faith. So there is a connection there, and that's you whether you knew why you experienced
You
that.
articulated well what I couldn't. So I was like, I had experienced that, and now
Hmm.
you've put it into words, so that makes a lot of sense. Um, so you said there's 12 chapters. There's 12 different virtues in the book. Each chapter has a corresponding work of literature. One of my favorite chapters. Um, I'm going to be embarrassed now because I didn't write down what the corresponding work of literature was, but it
That's all
was.
right. I'll be embarrassed if I can't remember.
Yeah,
So.
this is going to be good. I hope you're ready. It was the chapter on the cardinal virtue of prudence.
Oh, okay. That's the first chapter after the introduction.
It was the first
And
chapter. Yep.
yeah, and the reason you might not remember the work is because it's a pretty obscure work. It's important in literary history, but a lot of people haven't read it. And it's the history of Tom Jones, a
Mm.
foundling, the story of an orphan
Now I remember.
boy.
Yep.
Yeah, one of the first novels ever written in 18th century, in the 18th century. And yeah, now I get to ask you a question. What did you particularly like about that chapter or that virtue?
Uh, because you gave a word just like you just did. You articulated something that I had just experienced, but you gave me a word, prudence, that I didn't know was there, that I had just experienced, which was it played out like this. And some people might ask me, Hayden, how could I? Or actually, I'll give you a real life example. Somebody said to me, "Wouldn't it be nice if when you woke up in the morning there was a letter on your nightstand from God detailing every little thing that He wanted you to do?" And
Hmm.
I said, "Well, yeah, I guess, but wouldn't it be nice if He just wrote us an entire book like the Bible?" And but it really plays out practically the concept I'm trying to explain here. It plays out like this: someone will ask, "What what vocation does God want me to have, or who does God want me to marry?" These sorts of things. And I mean, I don't know what they're expecting. I mean, you're not going to turn to the Bible and find a
Hmm.
verse that says, "Hayden, I want you to be X when you grow up." If I found that in there, it'd be quite strange. But it's this idea of prudence where we can understand God's general will,
Hmm.
and then you have to use prudence to apply it to your particular situation. That's how I understand it, anyway. I don't know if
No,
that's the right
that's
concept.
really excellent. I mean, prudence is a subset of wisdom,
Mm-hmm.
and of course, God's will is the most wisdom that we can find, and yet applying it is a different story. And so prudence is basically applied wisdom, and so that's a perfect parallel, because we can be given sort of abstract concepts that have to do with wisdom or with God's will, but then practicing it requires prudence.
Right.
That's great. Yeah.
Yeah, so the word I had just always used was wisdom because I didn't know what else to say. But
Hmm.
applied wisdom would be a pretty good definition of the word prudence. So, yep,
Right.
that makes a lot of sense. Um, just a few more questions. My primary interest in reading is nonfiction. So I read because I just love to learn things, whether philosophical, scientific, or what have you. I like to learn. And so my primary reading has been through works of nonfiction. So I was just going to ask you, and it's not that I don't value fiction. I was just going to ask you, why should I read more fiction?
Well, I think that's sort of what I'm trying to show in the book,
Right? Right.
is that we don't read fiction to get information, although we can get information. So, for example, one of the books I write about is A Tale of Two Cities, and we learn a lot, even though it's a fictional account. We learn a lot about the French Revolution and England and those times. But if you wanted to learn about French history, it would be a lot better to actually just read a textbook.
Right.
So we can get information from reading uh, fiction and literature, but we read literary art, whether it's a novel or a short story or a poem, not because it informs us, but because it forms us. It
Right.
shapes us. It's an experience that can shape us, shape our character, shape our, experience, at least in a vicarious way. Um, and it just has that's actually more powerful in some ways than information, because I can get information off the internet and I can forget it. I can just use it when
Right.
I need it. But when we read a powerful story, or even think about music is, I think, something that's much more common to people's everyday experiences. um, it shapes us, it forms us, it gets inside us. We ourselves humming along or remembering the song
Yeah.
days or years later, because it becomes part of us. If we learn to read literary works just as well, then it becomes part of us as well.
I like
Which is
that.
why we need to read well and also choose well.
Uh, mhm.
We need to choose works that are of quality and substance, and that we also enjoy.
Yeah, I like the distinction between informs versus forms. That was a good little one-liner. I may take that if it's free.
Well, it's in the book, and I actually cite. I don't know if he originated it, but the one that the person who really drove that idea home to me is James K. A. Smith in his liturgical anthropology series, Desiring the Kingdom, Imagining the Kingdom, and Awaiting the King.
Okay. You said we need to choose well, so the follow-up question would be, how do we choose well?
That's a really good question.
Recommendations? Like,
Yes.
that's what my mind went to. Was
Yeah.
what's
Well, I
a
mean, I've got like 12 recommendations in this book,
right?
and a bunch more in my first book. All of my favorite works of literature, and there are lots of lists of great literature. I'm not someone who's big on saying, "Oh, here's my recommended list," because I think literary taste can be developed and it can
Mm-hmm.
be different from person to person. But basically, there's a canon of literature. There's a canon of Western literature, a canon of world literature, the works that have passed the test of time and that critics across the board recognize as being worthy. And I would say, any one of those lists, take a look at it, see what grabs your attention, maybe something you read in high school or were supposed to read in high school and you never did and you want to return to it. There's so much good literature out there. Even living my whole life around literature, I still haven't read 10% of the great literature out
Right.
there. So my recommendations are in this book and in my first book, and lots of great lists on the internet that you can find of the 100 most important novels
Right.
or something like that. So
Yep. Well, I was going to let you know, and you just used it as an example in the previous question. But your book has inspired me to read. I've already started reading A Tale of Two Cities. Actually, I was going to say you might be proud of me, but you probably won't be because I haven't technically started reading it because it's on an audiobook. Are you disappointed?
No, I am not. I'm learning to listen to audiobooks myself. Again, that's a skill that you have to acquire,
Mm-hmm.
just like reading is a skill, and a lot depends on the narrator. There's some excellent.
The narrator
Um,
has a wonderful British accent, so
okay,
it's
okay.
the reason I went with the audio is only because the semester started and I've got like 15 other books that I have to read right now. So I listen while I work
I do
out and things
not.
like that.
I do
Yeah.
not want you not doing your assignments. I'm listening to books when I run, because again, as a professor, I have a lot to read as well. So I
Mm.
definitely understand that. And no, I am proud of you. I am. That seems like a very difficult book to listen to. It would
It
be for
is.
me.
That's what I
Yeah.
was gonna say. Is I
All right.
definitely am gonna have to read it.
Okay. Well, I will give you the book that I listen to. Um, Among all of these, I think it's the only one I listened to. But I had read it a couple times, and then as I was writing this book, I wanted to listen to it again. I wanted to read it again, so I listened to it when I was running. And it's Cormac McCarthy's The Road.
The Road.
The Audible version is I don't remember who the narrator is, or but it's amazing. It's
Mm.
fantastic.
I will have to give it a
Um,
listen.
the Road is a very good book that translates well to audio and also a film. There's a great film adaptation which is pretty good too. So it's a dark and desolate and bleak
Mm.
work,
Yeah.
but I have that kind of taste. But it's also the one that I say shows us the virtue of hope. So
Yeah.
it's obviously not that dark.
Right. Okay. One last question. Why should the reader or the listeners or the viewers why is it important that they cultivate a habit of reading, particularly as Christians?
Well, again, our entire faith hinges on the word, capital W word, other lowercase w words, because the Bible is God's revealed word, especially if within Protestant Christianity,
Mm-hmm.
um, we prioritize the word over the image, and there's something about the way that the words are revealed in time in a linear fashion, which attunes us to logic and to eschatology and to the revelation of God in time and through time. There are just so many so many reasons
Right. Yeah.
why
Yeah. You could go
we
on.
should read. I mean,
Uh,
just the nature of words themselves, the nature of
mm-hmm.
written communication reflects the way the God of the Bible reveals
Right.
himself to us.
And so that would correlate not just to the Bible, but this is just reading in general then.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Okay.
And if we look back in history, we see that, during the so-called Dark Ages, when the world was sort of crumbling in chaos, it was the Christians who were preserving not only God's word, but other, extra biblical texts and letters and so forth, that would have been lost if the monks had not been painstakingly copying them down. They were the
Right.
only ones who were literate.
Mm-hmm.
It was the church that preserved literacy, and it was in the Middle Ages, and then it was the church that advanced literacy because they were prompted the invention of the printing press in order to get the Bible into everyone's hands, and then lo and behold, we were publishing Jane Austen too.
Right.
Lots of words, so literacy, we wanted widespread literacy for the sake of reading the Bible, but widespread literacy also advanced education and reading and thinking and the American Revolution and all that.
Yeah, very good. Okay, well, it has been wonderful to have you on. Thank you so much, and we'll have to do this the next time you write a book.
Thank you so much for having me. It was fun to talk to you.
All right, thank you. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to click the subscribe button below so that you'll be the first to know whenever we post a new episode. To gain access to the bonus segment, 5 more minutes, click the Patreon link below and follow that link to our Patreon website where you can become a supporter of the show for as little as $1 a month and gain access to all sorts of exclusive offers. Thanks so much for watching, and we will see you next time.